I'm going to show you how to analyze a paragraph and understand what you're reading. This builds on some previous videos about analyzing a sentence using grammar. So there's several types of text trees that you can use when you're reading, and each one has a different node size. A node is one box or thing in a tree. So for a sentence tree, also called a grammar tree, a typical node is one word. This time we're going to do a paragraph tree. A typical node is somewhere ranging from a clause up to a sentence. It takes some judgment call about how much to break up the sentences. There are also text trees for reading larger amounts of text. So you can have a section text tree based on paragraphs as nodes. And then you can have a chapter tree where the nodes are sections. And then you can have a book tree where the nodes are chapters. There is some flexibility on how you break things up. For example, if a section has too many paragraphs in it, you can use subsections or even sub-subsections. So you could have more levels of different trees, going from words all the way up to the entire thing that you're reading. Sometimes authors don't use sections. If you find that you have too many paragraphs that are all in one section, one article or whatever, then you can add your own sections. If an author doesn't break things up enough, you can break it up yourself. You can decide where would the author put section breaks if he was going to put them, and what would they be called, and then you can put them in yourself to help you analyze what you're reading. Similarly, some authors write really long paragraphs. So when you're doing a section tree, instead of a node being a paragraph, you might use half a paragraph as one node, because the paragraphs are too long and contain multiple different ideas. So it works better to split them up. Anyway, this might look like a lot of different things to learn, but it is approximately 3 different things to learn. So grammar trees are one thing, and they're pretty focused on grammar. And then when you do paragraph trees, they're pretty different. You're not worrying about grammar anymore, and instead you're going to focus a lot more on the relationships between the nodes, which we didn't do very much with sentence trees. And then when you do the next size up, a section tree or an essay tree or something, then you're going to be taking kind of big summary ideas and making a tree out of those, whereas with the paragraph tree, each node is a fairly small idea. So the sentence trees are the most different, and then all the rest are just combining different size groupings of ideas into a tree. So they're all kind of the same concept. So if you've done the first 3, then basically you understand it and you're done learning it. It shouldn't be difficult when you've done paragraph trees and section trees to expand it and do a book tree or whatever else. So here's a forum post by Justin, and we're going to discuss his paragraph. SENS is an anti-aging organization. They're trying to do medical research to increase longevity. I think this is a reasonably typical paragraph. It's not especially good or bad. So our main goals with the paragraph tree are going to be 1, we need to make a tree. It's going to show parent and child relationships between the nodes. And 2, we're going to explain those relationships. You'll see what that means soon. So first, I broke up the paragraph into nodes. Each of the nodes on screen ranges from a sentence to a clause. Some of them are less than a sentence, some of them are a whole sentence. We've got 8 different nodes. I tried to break them up roughly where there were separate ideas that seemed like they deserved their own separate attention. So the next thing I did is sort them for important ideas versus unimportant ideas. The unimportant ones are details or modifiers, or things that you could leave out. The important ideas are things that might be the main idea of the paragraph. I was trying to think which ones could be the main idea and which ones are definitely not the main idea, and I organized it that way. So it's kind of like the maybe pile and the no pile for what the main idea is. We want to find the main idea so we can have the root of our tree. and it might be hard to immediately figure out what that is, so you can start by sorting it into, this one's definitely not it, this one might be it. The next thing I did was look at the more important ideas and simplify them to try to see what I was dealing with. So the first one says basically you might have X. Next one is X might be a better focus. And finally, therefore, focusing on Y would be an error. I used variables here because it makes the sentences extra short. So the basic structure here is we have point 1, point 2, and then a conclusion. This helps us see what we're looking at. We've taken the whole paragraph and focused on just a couple parts. Variables are good for simplifying, but you don't always need them. In my case, the variables represent short phrases of 1 or 2 words, so they weren't really necessary. I'm using them anyways, so I can show you guys how to use them. Variables are also good for grouping. If you say x equals, and then you put several words, and then you keep calling that x, it's going to be really clear that that is one unit, one thing, because you refer to it as x, which is a single thing. Okay, so how do we figure out the root of the tree? Basically, the root is the conclusion. Parent-child relationships can also be thought of as whole/part relationships. The parent is being made up of the children, so it is the whole and the children are the parts. So you're integrating the parts to get the whole, the bigger thing. So the conclusion is integrated from the parts that are arguments, claims, evidence, premises, facts, stuff like that, reasons. You can also see parent-child relationship as main versus details. When you go lower down in the tree to stuff that is more nested, it is less important. It's more getting into little details instead of main points. So the arguments are the extra details that help the conclusion. So there it's children. Another way to see it is there's usually one conclusion based on multiple reasons. So the thing you have one of should be the root, not the thing you have multiple of. It is possible to have one argument and then reach 5 conclusions based on it, but that is atypical. So here is a partial tree of the paragraph, puts the conclusion on top, and then it puts the 2 reasons underneath it. So next we need to think about the relationships. These are a really important part of paragraph trees that we didn't see in sentence trees. So a very common basic relationship is because. We have this conclusion because of this child node. I did the tree 4 different ways to show you different ways you could organize something. One of them is just a style difference. So you can label the connection lines with the relationships, or you can give the relationships their own nodes. I generally prefer giving them their own nodes. It's easier to see and treats them as something important instead of a minor side note, but it's not that big a deal either way. So to a loose approximation, you will frequently have a tree that alternates. You'll have a node that is words from the paragraph, and then you'll have a relationship, a connection, an explanation of how it connects to the next thing, and then you'll have more words from the paragraph, and then another relationship, and then more words from the paragraph. It goes back and forth. It doesn't have to. Over here, we have 2 relationship nodes in a row because I used an and to group things together. But over on the far right, we've got an alternating pattern, which is common. I recommend using 2 colors for this type of tree, so that you can quickly see which ones are the relationship nodes and which ones are the regular nodes. If you write the relationships as side notes on the lines instead of their own nodes, then 2 colors would be less needed, but still nice to have. So it's also showing here different potential ways to look at the tree. So do we have a conclusion that is because the first thing and also because the second thing? Or do we have a conclusion that is because the group of 2 things? Or is it because one of the things And then there's actually a sub-relationship. So you can think about it. There are different possible ways to organize it. And you have to consider what makes sense for your paragraph. So if you're not sure, you can try doing it multiple ways and then look them over and see what worked out well. In this case, my favorite was the right one. I think focusing on y would be an error because x might be better, which is important because you might have x, meaning x might be the situation, might be the case. So I thought the sub-reason made sense there. Now that we have the tree started, we can add in the other details from the paragraph. So these are the nodes that I haven't included yet. First, I simplified them, so they're easier to work with. I brought back the whole paragraph because I needed to refer to it to figure out how to simplify them. To figure out what words like that referred to, and look at the context a bit to figure out what to do with each of the nodes. So now I want to start adding relationships between things. So we've got some different types of relationships. We have a restatement. X is the case, and then it's restated, there are X. So we can find that in the paragraph. I would guess that that is the case. And then it is a dash, which is a common punctuation used for restatements. And then we have that there are such more actionable problems. So he's trying to restate the same idea again in different words. Basically, he used two that's, and it's confusing, so then he restated it with the actual thing, more actionable problems. But when you use the variables, x, the restatement is unnecessary. It doesn't really add anything useful. This ending part, just some thoughts, I figured was a disclaimer. The point of it is to say, I might be wrong, don't take this too seriously, this isn't really thought through advice, it's a little bit half-baked. I don't want to be pushy, I don't want to tell you what to do. You know, I'm just giving you a little bit of advice, I didn't put a ton of work into it. Take it with a grain of salt. If it's helpful, great. If it's not helpful, that is okay. It sort of gives the person permission to not listen if they don't want to. Then we have this other grouping. This was the hardest one. So he said X doesn't contradict spending time on Y. So he's sort of arguing against his own conclusion that focusing on Y would be an error, but then he's like, well, maybe you could spend time on Y. So I decided he was trying to express a logical caveat, because he said necessarily. So he's like, it's not a logical necessity, but like maybe you should do it this way. The connection here was the most confusing. I came up with suggestion to ignore caveat, because what he's kind of saying is like, here's this, logical possibility that goes against what I'm saying, and then he's just sort of like, but maybe do what I'm saying anyways. He doesn't really give a great reason. I think the basic reason is that it was just a logical caveat. It wasn't actually a substantive point. He's just like, it's not 100% logically required, which who cares? We're trying to figure out what's reasonable or practical, not just what the very boundaries of logic are. So he brought up this logic thing for some reason, but then went against it. So I started putting the tree together. The caveat is for the main idea, and the disclaimer is also for the main idea. And then the restatement thing, I had to figure out where that goes. Because I don't yet have a connection node for it. I don't have any teal node. So next, I got a teal node attached to it. Sometimes you can find the relationship explained in the sentence. Like this one that said suggestion to ignore caveat. The sentence had the word but. So you could have used but as the relationship. It somewhat explains it. It's not as clear, but was in the sentence and is telling you something about the relationship. And this other one, he says it is a guess, so I used guess as the relationship. So he says he's guessing that being the thing in the previous sentence, so we can connect it to the thing in the previous sentence. Drawn the line, and now we have a tree. So that was a simplified tree where I had very shortened approximate versions of what the nodes were. I did lose some information. It was very abbreviated. So there are upsides and downsides to that. It's usually easier to work with really simple sentences and clauses. You've got less stuff to deal with, and you're focusing more on the main points. However, you don't have to simplify. If you know what you're doing, if you've done it a lot of times before, you might just skip the simplifying. It might be easy enough without simplifying. Alternatively, you can unsimplify at the end. So you can simplify, make the tree, then once you have the tree, you can undo that and look at the full version. So to unsimplify, you can replace the variables with words, phrases. And you can also replace nodes with original text. And it can be useful to have multiple versions of the final tree and compare them. So we'll do that. First, we're going to try removing variables. So we're going to take the y and change it into sends. Then the x becomes urgent problems. And we can keep going through. And we just do basic variable substitution. If that is confusing to you, then you might want to study some algebra. So now we have a tree with no variables in it. So it's a little bit longer, but it is also a little bit easier to read in some ways because you don't have to remember what the variables mean. Then we can go even further and put the original text back into the tree. So now each node is actual quotes of the forum post instead of my own wordings. I did add a couple things in square brackets to clarify, because when you break the paragraph up into parts, some of the references become problematic. You can't understand what it's referring to when you're only looking at that part. Like if you had the word he in a node, but there was nowhere in that node saying who he is, then you would have a problem. The node doesn't stand on its own. So I added a few notes in square brackets. So we can compare the original text with the simplified version. You can see in the simplified one, there are significantly fewer words. It's faster to read through it. You can look at the structure of the tree and get the big picture more quickly and easily. On the other hand, the original text has more details, and you can connect it back to the paragraph. It's easier to connect the nodes in the tree to the actual writing in the paragraph and relate them together and understand how the tree corresponds to the paragraph. You can also correspond between the two different trees. You can read the short version of something, and then if you're not sure about a detail, you can look at the longer tree and find the same node. So now that we have our trees, we can go back to the paragraph and try to understand what it's about. So here's the conclusion, which is in the middle. I looked for that first. I think it's a good place to start. The main point is that focusing on sends might be an error. The reason is that person might have more immediately actionable problems. So it could be better to focus on the more immediate problems instead of the long-term problem that without advancements in medical technology, you'll die of old age. And so Justin guesses that that is the case, that the person does have more immediate problems in their life. And then we get this caveat, and then we sort of take it back, and then we have the disclaimer, the permission to not be bossed around by this paragraph. I try not to get very hung up on details. There are problems, like this comma might be wrong. I think the first sentence might have a grammar error. It's hard to tell exactly what the intention is. And then I think there are reference or pronoun errors, because we have the you might have more, and then there's the I would guess that that is the case. So what this should mean is you're guessing that the thing you said earlier is the case, and the thing you said earlier is you might have more immediately actionable problems. So there's the might have is included in the original thing, so when you refer to it, it should be included still. But then this restatement here says that there are such more actionable problems. So restatement drops the might. It doesn't restate it as that there might be more actionable problems. It restates it that there are more actionable problems. So the might turned into or are. So analyzing text is also useful for writers. They can try to understand what they're trying to say. You can construct it as a tree potentially first and then write your paragraph. Like if you make an organized tree and then you try to write a paragraph to go with it, you'll probably get a paragraph that actually makes sense and is organized and flows well. Anyway, the main points here were how do you make a paragraph tree? And in particular, you add nodes for the relationships between the sentences. You try to understand how the different parts fit together and actually put that into words. Why are these sentences in the same paragraph? What is the connection between them? Making a paragraph tree should get you thinking about that. It should also get you thinking about what is the main point and what are lesser points, details, optional bits, stuff like that. So what is the focus and what is not the focus? Methods like these let you work through understanding a paragraph. They give you a way to not be stuck and not be confused and not be unsure what to do and so on. There are steps you can go through step by step. And if you practice them, then even when you run into a hard case, you're used to going through the steps so you can still go through them. If you wait until a paragraph seems really hard and then you try to do the steps and it's the first time or the second time you're doing the steps, you're probably going to struggle because then you're learning two things at once. You're trying to deal with a hard paragraph and you're trying to use unfamiliar steps. So you want to take the steps in this video and practice them until you're comfortable with them. And then after that, you can start using them on just the paragraphs you find difficult. But at first, you want to practice them on some paragraphs that aren't really very difficult for you, so you can focus on learning the steps on how to do a paragraph tree. So like and subscribe, and you can go to my website, read my articles, sign up to get emails from me.